Well, this morning we want to give our attention in the study of God's Word again to the book of Daniel. If you want to take your Bibles and turn with me to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. This is the end of the narrative portion of the book, essentially. And it continues on the subject of the sovereignty of God. If you've been with us as we've been going through the book of Daniel together, you know that we have seen God's sovereignty on display throughout the study of this great book. In Daniel chapter 1, we see that God is sovereign over the nation of Israel, and indeed is the reason that they wind up going into captivity. In Daniel chapter 1, we're told, starting in verse 1, it's the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And why is it that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is able to conquer Jerusalem and subjugate the nation of Judah beneath his authority? The reason is stated in verse 2, because the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, which he brought to the land of Babylon, basically, and stored them in the temple or in the house of his God. And that winds up being instrumental later on in Daniel chapter 5 when his grandson actually brings those items out. You see God's sovereignty throughout the book of Daniel. God is sovereign in his people going into captivity in Babylon. The nation of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah do not wind up going into captivity because God is not able to preserve his people. They go into captivity because they have been unfaithful to him, and so he turns them over to the Gentiles, and they wind up going into captivity. By the way, an important thing to point out in chapter 1 is it's not just the wicked who wind up going into captivity, it's also those who are really devoted and faithful to God. They endure the subjection to Gentiles just like the rest of the nation does, and you see this in Daniel and his three friends going into captivity even though they are noble youths. Nebuchadnezzar takes Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and he hauls them off into captivity in that initial wave of subjugation of Judah and the incorporation of it into the Babylonian Empire. And yet, what you see is that even from a young age, somewhere between 13 and maybe as old as 16 or 17, but probably 13 to 15 years of age, Daniel and his three friends are hauled off into captivity in Babylon, and they are given the best training and preparation for service in the Babylonian Empire in a political and administrative way. And they demonstrate their absolute faithfulness to God by holding to the law of God even in a Gentile context. And God preserves them and blesses them. In Daniel chapter 2, we see very much that God is articulating through a vision to a Gentile king, Nebuchadnezzar, that he is sovereign and in control of all of the events of history and the elevation and subjugation of all nations, not just his own nation. And this is seen in the vision of the statue, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has. You remember that God gives Nebuchadnezzar a recurring dream that so upsets him that he makes an impossible demand upon his wise men to say, I want you to tell me the dream so I know I can trust you when you give me the interpretation. And they say, nobody can do this but God. Well, that's it. You're all going to die. And God gives the dream, reveals the dream and the interpretation of the dream to Daniel. You'll also remember in Daniel chapter 2 that Daniel is very faithful to say, hey, listen, Nebuchadnezzar, I'm here to tell you the dream and give you its interpretation from God, but this I don't know it because there's anything special about me. This is given to me for you from God. And at the end of Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges the greatness of Daniel's God, but he also elevates Daniel even higher in his kingdom's authority. In Daniel chapter 3, you'll see that Daniel is not the only one that is put on the spot in Babylon because his three friends are elevated into positions of administration. And Nebuchadnezzar, in order to solidify his authority, decides to have a great monument made to himself. And this is not unheard of in ancient pagan kings, especially as they begin to subjugate multiple peoples beneath their authority. I just remind you, just as a side note here, remember that even in the Roman Empire, Caesar had an annual exercise where everybody was required to offer a pinch of incense acknowledging Caesar as their god. Why? Because that shows loyalty and devotion on an empire-wide level. Well, that's what Nebuchadnezzar's doing in Daniel chapter 3. Builds an idol to himself. Maybe it was the dream vision that God had given him previously that gave him the idea. But in any case, he builds this great idol and he brings all of his officials and has them bow down and worship it and acknowledge his sovereignty as an exercise of unification of the empire. All of you guys that work for me, all of you guys that I've elevated into positions of authority, wherever you're from, I want you to acknowledge me as your absolute supreme and sovereign. Well, there are three guys that won't: Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so when they get pointed out, they get brought before the king. And when they will not bow down before that idol, they're cast into the fiery furnace. And what do we see? God delivers Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the fiery furnace. And what does that demonstrate? That God is sovereign and able to preserve his people even in a foreign land. The God of Israel is the one true, the living God, the almighty, the all-powerful God, and he can deliver his people. And Nebuchadnezzar testifies to that. In not Nebuchadnezzar chapter 4. In Daniel chapter 4, we have Nebuchadnezzar's testimony and how God brings him, in my opinion, he brings him to faith in the one true God by giving him a vision and a warning through Daniel, and then humbling him for 7 years, when as a lunatic he lived like a cow in a field. And then God brings him back and elevates him right back to the throne, and the second half of his reign is even more prosperous than the first half of his reign. And Nebuchadnezzar testifies as such in Daniel chapter 4, that he is the one, the true, the only God, and his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. That is a recurrent theme as you're reading through Daniel and the narratives that you should be picking up. That the book of Daniel is about God's sovereignty and the fact that he is in control of all kingdoms, and he has an ultimate goal for history, which is to establish his kingdom. God is sovereign over creation. God is sovereign over all nations. And God has a kingdom that he is going to bring that is an eternal kingdom. That is the testimony at the end of every chapter as we've been going through this text. And likewise, when you get to Daniel chapter 5, you have a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar that's on the throne. And you have the Medo-Persian Empire outside the city gates. And Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, begins to get all of his nobles together to solidify a unification of where we can stand up to this assault and to this invasion. And his dad, who is the king of Babylon, flees. But Belshazzar, the son of the ultimate king of Babylon in those days, he is there in Babylon, and he takes the vessels from the house of Israel, from the temple, and he uses them to party with and to honor the gods of Babylon. And lo and behold, the writing is on the wall. His kingdom is going to end today. His kingdom is going to end today. And it's Daniel that God sends to inform him that this is the message to you. You did not learn. You should have known better, given what I did with your grandfather and what he testified to me. You should have known better. But because you've acted this way, you have been weighed and measured and found wanting, and you're done. And that very night, the Medo-Persian Empire rolls into town, takes over the kingdom, and Belshazzar is executed. Well, that's where we pick up in Daniel chapter 6. In fact, if you look at the last couple of verses of Daniel chapter 5, what you'll see in verses 30 and 31 at the end of Daniel chapter 5 is that same night that the writing was on the wall, and none of the wise men can interpret it. But the queen mother comes in and says, hey, there is a guy, and his name is Daniel, and you need to ask him what this means, because in your grandfather's day, Daniel was in authority and was able to interpret dreams and speak for God. And so when Belshazzar summons Daniel in, he says, I'll make you the third ruler in the kingdom if you just tell me what this means. And Daniel says, I don't need any of your gifts, but I'll give you the interpretation. You have been weighed and measured and found wanting, and you're done. And lo and behold, right after he gives Daniel the reward of elevating him to the third position of authority within the kingdom, guess what happens? He's done. Verse 30, that same night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. And so Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Darius the Mede. Now there's a lot of questions as to Darius or Darius. It's actually in the original. I've done a lot of work on this. The pronunciation of the name is actually Darius, unless you think the should be pronounced differently. There's a lot of argumentation in seminary context about whether it's Darius or Darius. I'm going to go with Darius because it's, I think, the most common way it's pronounced in English. But Darius the Mede is a person who, outside of the Bible, there's no historical record of him. And that's led liberals and others to say, oh, he doesn't really exist. This is an obvious error in the Bible. Can I just, on a very fundamental, basic level, just give this answer definitively? This is an historical record. This is an historical record, the Bible. And unlike all other historical records, this one is inspired by God. I don't need anything in archaeology, and I don't need any secular documents to survive through thousands of years in order to lend credence or credibility to what the biblical record says. The Bible is true, period. Now, the question is, well, if we take it as true, who is this Darius or Darius? Who is this Darius the Mede that's mentioned here? And there are several views. Some have suggested that it's one of the generals, whether it's Ugbaru or Gubaru. And by the way, those are real names. They will be on the quiz. But if And incidentally, I got to say, Chuck, would you agree with me? If your name was Ugbaru or Gubaru and you got appointed as king of Babylon, would you change your name? I sure would, but I digress. The point is, it was not uncommon for people that got appointed into positions of authority to change their names. I don't think that's what happened. The general that was under Cyrus that conquered Babylon in those days died 3 weeks after the city was conquered, according to historical records. The other guy was a governor that also was part of the greater empire of Cyrus's Medo-Persian Empire. I think the best answer here is one of two answers which evangelical commentators have landed on. Either Darius the Mede is Cyrus. So if you look at Daniel chapter 6 and verse 28, this is one of the views that commentators have had throughout the years. It says in verse 28, so this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. You can translate that even in the reign of Cyrus the Persian, which would mean that Cyrus and Darius are the same guy. It's two different names. That's possible. And there are a number of commentators that hold that position. However, I think it is best to see this Darius as mentioned here because he is appointed by Cyrus to be the king over Babylon when Cyrus and his empire conquers Babylon. He is appointed as a client king. And that's also indicated there in verse 31 of Daniel chapter 5. Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. This is not the conquering king who comes in and took the kingdom. He received it. And the idea there of received speaks in a legal sense. having received the kingdom. And I think the best way to handle this then is that Darius the Mede is somebody who is an older guy, an experienced administrator, and he gets appointed by Cyrus because Cyrus can trust him to be the client king, elevated into the position of client king now over this newly conquered kingdom that gets added to the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, if you want to go with the view of Cyrus, that's fine, but we're going to walk through and recognize Darius as an individual who is a king appointed by Cyrus in Babylon, and he's given full authority as a king to rule the now conquered Babylonian Empire in Cyrus's name. So, it's part of the Medo-Persian Empire, but not the ultimate king of kings of that empire. And I want you to see that what we've seen up to this point in Daniel is that God is sovereign over His people and their circumstances, and that holds true not only when they're in the land, but also when they're in captivity. And He is sovereign over kingdoms and over kings, and even over who is king and who is removed as king. That's what we've seen through Daniel 1 through 5, right? Well, now we're going to see God's sovereignty over not just nations and peoples, but even over the individual lives of His own faithful servants. Namely, in this context, over Daniel and his life. And there's 4 ways that we're going to see God's sovereignty on display here in the individual lives of His people. 4 ways that this is revealed to us in the text, and they are all P's. So even Chuck will be happy. You ready? You're going to see the sovereignty of God attested by the prominence of Daniel, the plots of the wicked, the power of God, and then finally in the proclamation of the king. You're going to see the sovereignty of God in the individual, even over the individual lives of God's people, demonstrated through the prominence of Daniel, the plots of the wicked, the power of God, and the proclamations of the king. Now let's take a look at each of those in turn, shall we? We start with seeing the sovereignty of God over not just all of creation generally, not just over nations corporately or nationally, not just over kings in authority, but even over the individual circumstances of the lives and the details of the lives of His personal servants. First of all, the prominence of Daniel, verses 1 through 10 of Daniel chapter 6. Notice in verse 1 that it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, and that these satraps might be accountable to them, that is, to the commissioners, and that the king might not suffer loss. So Cyrus comes in and he conquers Babylon. And just again, historical background for you for a minute. Remember that Belshazzar, who was the king of the city of Babylon, his dad is actually the king of the Babylonian Empire. Well, he gets routed by Cyrus and the Medo-Persian army, and he flees to Babylon, tells his son to hold out, and then he runs off and hides. Later on, he winds up dying in captivity, in isolation. Well, he leaves his son behind to hold the city, and the city falls one night by divine sovereignty. And so Darius rolls in, and he gets appointed by Cyrus now to be the king of Babylon. It's now a subjugated nation underneath the Medo-Persian kingdom. But Cyrus is 62 years old. He's an older guy. That's actually how old I am, at least for another month. And that's that's a guy of some years and some experience, and it's a guy that Cyrus can trust, and he says, I'm going to make you king of Babylon. I want you to govern it for me. Okay, well, it seemed good to Darius. As he takes a charge of the city of Babylon and then ultimately of the kingdom, it seemed good to him to divide the kingdom up into 120 satrapies. You say, what is that? It's like provinces. It's like little divisions. It's like what we might call counties or something along those lines, or states. He divides it up into, the technical term in the ancient context is satrapies. So there's 120 divisions, or 120 counties basically, and there's a ruler, an administrator in charge of each county. What do those administrators do? Well, they're satraps. That's the official term for the title for the office. They're in charge of overseeing all the matters of official matters of state and taxation, etc., on behalf of the king. So they'll have peacekeepers, they'll have administrators, they'll have tax collectors, that kind of thing. And so they're part of the government, and they work directly for the king. But managing 120 people is not the easiest thing that you could ever do. So what he does is he says, I'm going to break that up, and I'm going to have 3 commissioners, one overseeing about a third. So whether it was 40, 40, 40, or whatever it is, he divided then those counties or those satrapies up into 3 basic departments, and he appointed 3 commissioners, a little bit of a higher office that report directly to him, and each of them is responsible for a percentage, about a third of those satraps reporting to them. And the reason he decides to set it all up this way is so that he can talk to 3 people, and those 3 guys then can work out the details in the 3 areas of the kingdom. And Daniel was one of those 3. Now, how does Daniel, remember we said last time that Daniel was about 80 years of age, 80, 82, somewhere between 78 and 82 years of age. Now that's an old guy. Would you agree with that? I'm an old guy, and I'm a few years I'm about 20 years behind that. Me now 20 years older. How does a guy then that's 80 wind up in charge of a third of the kingdom when a new king comes in and gets appointed? How do you get picked when you're 80? Answer, chapter 5. What was the last thing Belshazzar did before the city was conquered and he was executed? He appointed Daniel to be the 3rd ruler over the kingdom. Well, where's the first ruler? Well, that's Belshazzar's dad. He's fled. Well, who's the second ruler? Well, they put him to death. So who's the 3rd ruler that just got announced and appointed in that position? Daniel. Daniel's been retired, probably been retired for about the last 15 years since Nebuchadnezzar died. He was a high-ranking muckety-muck in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom and empire. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar, even when Daniel was like probably 17 or 18, he put him in charge of all the wise men, and then he elevated him even higher than that after a couple of the experiences with Daniel and the way that God opened his eyes. Well, when Nebuchadnezzar exits from this life, it is highly likely, since we never read or hear about Daniel, and since Belshazzar doesn't know about Daniel and his mom has to tell him, it's very likely that for 15 years-ish or so that he went off the scene, just living there as a retired statesman in Babylon. And God orchestrates the circumstances of Belshazzar's death in such a way that Daniel gets brought back onto the scene, and that night that the invasion takes place, Belshazzar appoints Daniel to the highest position of authority apart from his dad and himself. When he's executed and his dad's gone, the Medo-Persians come in and say, okay, who's in charge here? Well, you just killed him, so I guess that leaves me now. And lo and behold, when Darius gets appointed, you know what he does? He sees the quality of Daniel, and Daniel is elevated to prominence in an extraordinary way. This is an extraordinary elevation back into the government, into the forefront, and very quickly, Daniel is placed in charge of a third of the kingdom. Now, why do you think that is? Because he got a lot of experience from back in the day running the kingdom with Nebuchadnezzar. And I would be shocked if when we get to heaven, I mean, some of these conversations I can't wait to have. But Daniel, what did you do during those 7 years when Nebuchadnezzar was out in the field like a cow? Probably ran the kingdom. And who was it that sent for Nebuchadnezzar when the 7 years were up, like God told him? Probably Daniel, bringing Nebuchadnezzar back and elevating him back to that position. Anyways, so this is a pretty extraordinary way to go from retired and doing nothing to now responsible for a third of the kingdom again. And by the way, you'll also notice it's not only an extraordinary elevation back into the government, it's an extraordinary spirit and service that he is providing, that God has gifted him with. Verse 3, then this Daniel began distinguishing himself. Now, this isn't hard to understand given the fact that he had decades of experience previously under King Nebuchadnezzar, but even remember that his training in Daniel chapter 1 from his youth up was in multiple languages and administration. He had been prepared for this in the finest institutions in Babylon to serve in this capacity, and lo and behold, God brings him back onto the scene. And this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners. So he's got the 3 commissioners. He's one of them. And he is outperforming not just his other 2 commissioners, but also all the satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And lo and behold, it doesn't take long for Darius to recognize that. And so the king planned to do what? To appoint him over the entire kingdom. You know what? Daniel, you are so capable and so able to do this. I'm just going to put you in charge of all of it. I'm going to put you over all of it. You know what you're doing. You've got all this experience. You can handle everything amazingly. You know, by the way, this is a footnote here. Real leaders don't do or oversee everything. Real leaders are not control freaks. Real leaders don't have to have everything exactly the way they want it. Real leaders recognize the capabilities of other qualified leaders and entrust them and facilitate them being able to exercise their gifts and giftedness and mature and accomplish great things, in some cases even beyond what you could have ever thought to be able to do yourself. If you have to be in charge and in control of everything, then you are limited by your abilities, by your knowledge, by your capabilities and your insights. If you really want to go beyond what just you can do by yourself, then you recognize, elevate, and empower very capable and reliable leaders. And that's Daniel. And that's what Darius recognizes very quickly. This Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps. Why? Because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. There's a gifting from God that's on display here. Together with his experience and training and all the time he spent with Nebuchadnezzar and his familiarity with the kingdom and the way it was set up in Nebuchadnezzar's day, and then God's presence, his personal integrity, Daniel just stood out. And so Darius intends to elevate him above everybody and put him in charge of the whole deal. This is an extraordinary elevation back into prominence that God has done for Daniel, and it's an extraordinary spirit and service that is on display through Daniel, and he demonstrates extraordinary integrity in the context of service. Listen, you want to be used by God in your life? Then demonstrate real integrity in whatever your responsibilities are and whatever your calling is. You don't have to be a pastor. You don't have to have some high and noble calling. Daniel had a job as a statesman, and he just did it with true integrity. Integrity by itself stands out in a way the world that sits up and takes notice. Notice the extraordinary integrity and service that Daniel displays. Verse 4, then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. Well, why is that? Because they don't want him in charge of them. This is an old guy. He was retired, and he's not one of us. And now Darius is elevating him above everybody. We're all going to wind up working for Daniel. You know something? A person of integrity is not a person that you want to work for unless integrity is important to you. And jealousy, anxieties. If you're a crooked politician in particular, if you're in politics, if you're in administration, if you're in authority, and you got a guy that's holding fast to biblical integrity, it's going to step on your toes. They have no interest in Daniel being elevated like this. And so they start trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. And lo and behold, guess what? They can't find any. Middle of verse 4, they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful. And here's another one. This is where I might go from preaching to meddling in some of your lives. No negligence or corruption was found in him. You know what the idea of negligence means? Not working as hard as you should. Not putting in a full day's work for a full day's wage. Not being fully responsible to work as hard and as faithfully and as well as you could. I remember from corporate days. I remember conviction when I got saved. You know, you show up late, you make up for it by leaving early for lunch, which you make up for by getting back late from lunch, and then you leave early from work to even it all out. Or you spend X amount of time at the water cooler or by the coffee pots chatting about whatever rather than doing your job, and then you tell your boss, well, it was just too much work to get done this week, and so I'll have it done by Monday or Tuesday, and you can come up with new excuses. You know something? They couldn't find... Daniel's in his 80s. And he's working harder than everybody. Daniel's in his 80s, and there is literally nothing. A guy that is responsible for a third of the kingdom, and you can't find any corruption? Okay, this is special. Agreed? By the way, these are the reasons why God can make such use of Daniel. You want to be useful in God's hands? Be a person of integrity. Be a person of diligence. Be a person of faithfulness. And by the way, just because you are that kind of person and God does elevate you into that kind of position, don't think that that means then everything should go well in your life. We'll see that in a minute. Notice in verse 5. Notice his extraordinary reputation before men. These men, this would be the other two chief administrators or commissioners and some of the satraps who were more local there, working together, jealous of Daniel. These men said, we're not going to find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. Isn't that interesting? You know, the only thing about Daniel that stands out that we would have any chance of finding fault with him is his devotion to his God and his dedication to hold to the law of his God. That's the only way we're going to ever find any ground of accusation. Because in everything else, he's just characterized by total integrity. Let me ask you, you know, the last few weeks we've been talking about total devotion to Christ, right? Being publicly identified with Christ as one of his, being sold out to him, being committed to standing out in your life and in your relationships as one who is loyal to God above all, right? That's Daniel. You want to know what makes Daniel such a choice servant of God for his whole life? It's that total dedication to God and to him being obedient to his word. That's it. And these men, his enemies, trying to find a way to undo him and tear him down, say that, you know what, there's no way we can. The guy's too diligent and the guy's too characterized by integrity to ever find any way to tear him down there. But he's also absolutely dedicated to his God. So if we want to find a way to catch him, it's going to have to be there. And notice the extraordinary means they go to trap him. Then these commissioners and satraps, by the way, this is not all the satraps, they would have been scattered throughout the kingdom, but there's a plurality of them, probably the ones most locally responsible. The satrapies most nearly localized with regard to Babylon. But the commissioners, that's the other two guys in charge of all of them, and some satraps, they came by agreement to the king. That idea of by agreement means that after they talk through it, they all come to consensus. This is what we're going to do, and together they come and appear before the king. And they spoke to him as follows: King Darius, live forever. Oh, king, live forever. That's just like long live the king in the UK. It's just a formal greeting. It's an expression of respect. And in verse 7, all the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Now, one thing, just historically to cover, the law of the Medes and the Persians is a law that subjugated the king beneath the law. This is different than Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar was the law. He said it, that settles it, we're doing it. Well, the law of the Medes and the Persians, the king could make any law that he wants, but once he made it law, then it sticks. The king makes the laws, but he's also then under the laws. And so you can see, for example, the trickiness of that even in Esther. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that's the way things were in the Medo-Persian Empire. And then also remember that Darius is a king over Babylon, but he is under Cyrus, king of the Medo-Persian Empire. Right? So you have a plurality of kingdoms. Cyrus is over all of them. Darius is now the king of Babylon. But he's under ultimately the authority of Cyrus and the Medo-Persian law. So if he makes this law, it can't be changed. Now if we go back to verses 6 through 8, notice that the commissioners, so we got two commissioners and a plurality of satraps, they come in together by agreement, and they tell the king, hey, listen, verse 7, all the commissioners of the kingdom. Who are all the commissioners of the kingdom? Well, these two guys, and who's the other one? Daniel. You know what they just said? We talked to Daniel, and we've talked to all the other officials. In fact, they go so far as to say, and these are just subordinate officers, right? All the commissioners of the kingdom and the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together, and we all agree. And Daniel's obviously never been consulted, right? But they're telling the king, we all talked about it, and we all agree that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction. A statute is a law, and the injunction is the implementation of that law with the together with the consequence of disobeying it. That anyone who makes a petition to any god or man, by the way, a petition is a request, but the context here is making a petition in the context of prayer or speaking to anyone as though they are above the king, speaking to any god or any other authority like their king. This doesn't mean that a husband can't ask his wife to pass the salt or vice versa. All right? And all the commentators talk about that. It's not simple like that. It's obviously couched in the term of prayer and an expression of true sovereign loyalty. In other words, nobody can address anybody except for you for the next 30 days as their sovereign. That's what the petition is. You say, well, why would any king ever do something like this? Well, the same reason that Nebuchadnezzar built the statue and had all of his authorities gathered there on the plains and said, okay, you're all going to bow down and you're going to worship that idol and demonstrate your total subjection to me and to my authority. Keep in mind, when you're in an ancient context like this, every nation, every kingdom had its own god or gods. Only Israel recognized the one true God, the sovereign above all gods, and that there were no other gods. Every other kingdom had gods. Rome had gods. Most of them they borrowed from the Greeks and from others. They just renamed them. Listen, every kingdom believed in a plurality of gods. And so to worship one God or another God or do a favor for one God or another God or acknowledge a God, that's not that big of a deal like it is if you're a Jew in Daniel's day or you're a Christian today. We all recognize there is one God. You know the only people that have a problem with acknowledging Caesar as God or acknowledging Darius as God or Nebuchadnezzar as God, as a sovereign, the only people that have a problem with that, the people that recognize there is only one God. That'd be the Jews in the Old Testament. That'd be Christians today. That'd be Christians in the first century who said, no, I'm not going to offer a pinch of incense to Caesar, acknowledging him as my sovereign God. There's only one God. I will not use that term to refer to a person other than the Lord Jesus Christ. And you can crucify me or feed me to the lions if you want. And that's what they did. Nobody would have a problem with it. Nobody had a monotheistic approach apart from those who really are believers. So, lo and behold, all of your officials, now that you're setting up your kingdom and getting everything all set up, one thing that we think that would be a really good idea, and all of us as authorities under you, we all talked about this, and we think you should have a month where everybody acknowledges your total sovereignty over them, and you can't make any petitions to anybody but you. This would be a great way to unify the nation underneath your authority. And so we want you to sign it as a law and establish it as an injunction according to the law of the Medes and the Persians so that it can't be changed, and this will be great. We're all convinced this will be great for the kingdom and solidify your leadership. In verse 9, therefore King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. He signed it. Why would he do that? All the commentators say is pride. I don't believe pride is always a part of things, but I think he just fell. I don't think he fell for the idea of saying, hey, this is all my new guys that are working for me. They all think the world of me. They want to call me God. I don't think it's that simple. In fact, the way he responds as things play out, I think testify otherwise. He thinks this is a great move to solidify his authority. I don't think this is pride. It's not his idea either. This isn't like Nebuchadnezzar says, I want you to all bow down and worship me. He's 62 years old. He's only in the position he's in because Cyrus appointed him to it. It's a brand new kingdom, and all of his administrators are suggesting this is a good idea. I think it's safe to say he agrees to it because it's in keeping with traditional exercises of public affirmation and submission to a new authority and unity with that ruler. And so, okay, if you guys all think that's a good idea, let's go for it. Now, I want you to notice in verse 10 the extraordinary devotion that Daniel has to God. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, that's stated definitively in the text. You know what that means? Daniel wasn't part of any of the discussions. Daniel wasn't consulted in any way, shape, or form, but it gets signed into law. And he finds out now, probably through public proclamation, that this has been signed into law. And you got to imagine that he knows where this came from. Daniel knew the document was signed. And you know what he did? He entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. I read a bunch of commentators this week who get into a discussion, did Daniel work through this in his heart and consider, he had to have, when he found out this was signed, he had to think, well, maybe I just pray for the next month with the windows closed, or maybe I move the time of day that I'm praying, or maybe I just do it, downstairs with the, and so nobody sees me. Maybe I change my practices just for a month, because you wouldn't want to lose the opportunity you have to be involved in the government at the highest level and be protective of God's people. And Daniel's going to be actively involved in Cyrus ultimately sending the Jews back to Jerusalem. Daniel had to be thinking these thoughts. I don't believe Daniel thought any of those thoughts even for a moment. Do you know, faithfulness is like sin. Follow me. Faithfulness in the Christian life is like sin in the Christian life. When a big threat comes, whatever it is, you behave in accordance with what you have established as your convictions. In 2 Samuel 11, Daniel sins with Bathsheba. Remember that? But in that same context, you know what we're told? We're told that it's the time when kings go off to war, and where's Daniel? He's at home. If you read the history of David and his life up to that point, David multiplied wives and concubines. David prepared himself to fail. David had an area of his life where he had compromised his integrity, and when the opportunity to take another man's wife for himself, and then the cover-up of it that followed, that even resulted in him facilitating the murder of her husband. Listen, David set himself up for that failure. David didn't get up one day and say, well, I'm a man after God's own heart, but today I'd like to sin. A major moral failure does not come about overnight. And major moral, spiritual faithfulness does not come about overnight. You want to know why Daniel finds out the document signed and just continues as he's been doing previously to worship God, to go up into his upper room? By the way, the idea of an upper room here, if you're familiar with like the things we've studied architecturally with regard to ancient Near Eastern homes and structures like that, most are one story, and then that upper room is actually just an upper floor. It's the roof. There'd be a staircase on the outside to get up onto the roof, and then you could walk around. That was like an outside room or the back patio. The fact that he had an upper room shows that he had a rather substantial dwelling or residence in Babylon. Why is that? Because all the time he spent working for Nebuchadnezzar, he was elevated and was almost certainly quite wealthy. So he has an upper room, and he's got a window facing Jerusalem. Why? Because that's what you read in, 1 Kings 8, where Solomon, when he built the temple, said, if you've got a Gentile that prays to you, God, and they face here where your temple is, then hear their prayers so that they might know that you are the one God above all gods and the only God. Likewise, in Psalm 138, David says this, I will give you thanks with all my heart. I will sing praises to you, speaking to God before the gods. I will bow down toward your holy temple and give thanks to your name for your loving kindness and your truth, because you have magnified your word according to all your name. I will face Jerusalem. I will face your temple, and I will praise you and give thanks to you. That's what David wrote. Why the focus on Jerusalem? Why the focus on the temple? Because that's where God established his presence. He established his name. And Daniel spent his whole life in captivity now since he was about 13 years of age. And you know what he established as a pattern? Every day, 3 times a day. He went home. He got up into his upper room, opened up the windows, probably bought the house because it had windows facing Jerusalem, knelt down on his knees, and he prayed. And you even notice he was praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. He kneeled on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks. That word praying generally means to pray, to make requests, to implore, to beseech, to ask. That second word means to praise or give thanks. Both of them are participles, by the way, which means this was a regular practice. Every morning when he got up, in the midday when he came home for lunch, and every evening he went up to his second floor, opened the windows to Jerusalem, and he worshiped God. That's a good prayer life. That's a faithful prayer life. That's a purposeful act of worship. You know, when you pray in a devotional sense, it should be aimed at being a formal act of worship. A lot of what you should be saying in your prayer, like Daniel is doing here, are praises and the expression of thanks. You can tell a person's devotional life by how much of what they say to God is a request versus how much of what they say to God is an expression of praise and worship and thanks. I mean, that's a good way to evaluate your own spirituality and your own worship. Are you characterized by giving of thanks, or are you characterized by making requests? The more you request of God, and why you're asking for and why you're asking for it. We're going to get a good taste of Daniel's prayer life in Daniel chapter 9, but for now, just as a summary, I want you to notice that Daniel demonstrates extraordinary devotion to God. When he finds out it's now illegal to pray, do you know what he does? The same thing he's always done. He worships God. He worships God. You see the prominence of Daniel. It's a clear testimony to God's sovereignty. God is the one that elevated him to that position. And why did he elevate him to that position? Because he had been faithful. And even when his life is threatened, he continues to be faithful. And the only grounds upon which those opposed to him can find fault with him are his devotion to God, his unwavering devotion to God. Let me just ask you very quickly before we go further. Is your life like this? If you feel like God's not using you, could it be because your life is not like Daniel's? We move on, secondly, to God's sovereignty on display, not only through the prominence of Daniel, but through the plots of the wicked. I could have called this the powerlessness of a king. It's also a P, but we're going to focus on the plots of the wicked because that's the primary emphasis in the text. The plots of the wicked, verse 11 through 18. Notice they set a trap and then they spring it. Verse 11, then these men came by agreement. Again, that's our expression. They had conspired together. And when they came up with this idea for the king to make this law, they did it specifically so they could trap Daniel, because they know what his habit, his devotion, and his practices are. So they come by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Now, whether they stood outside the window and looked and pointed, or whether they burst in and caught him on his knees, the text doesn't tell us, but in either way, it was a common enough pattern. It was a testimony of Daniel's devotion to God that everybody knew. And by the way, Daniel's 80, 82, and he's still faithful to God. 70 years. 70 years. That's longer than I've been alive. 70 years. Daniel has been consistently faithful to God. He is so faithful and so disciplined and so regular and diligent in his devotion to God that he can get caught in it. And that's what they did. They came by agreement. They all show up right at a time when Daniel's praying, and they find him, sure enough, making petition and supplication before his God. And having now gone and seen what they knew they were going to see, now they run and report to the king. And I want you to notice this. They've got to be really thrilled with themselves having caught Daniel. They approach and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. And I love the way they say this. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? Listen, why do you think they asked the king to confirm what he's done? Okay? This is like when your kids come, hey, Mom, didn't you say that Timmy isn't supposed to? Yes. Well, Timmy is. Doesn't it sound like that? Didn't you say that we're not supposed to? Yeah, well, you know what my brother's doing? Look at the big smile on Miko. You've done this, haven't you? That's what I thought. The king replied, the statement is true. You know what that is? That's a formal way to say yes, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Yes, I signed that, and we can't change that law. The implication is why. And then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah. He pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but he keeps making his petition 3 times a day. By the way, I can't imagine that they stayed there until he had done it 3 times. They went, they caught him, and they went and told him that this is them showing they know he does this 3 times a day. And I remind you, when they went to the king to start with, what did they tell him? We all talked about this, and we all agreed to us, all of us commissioners and satraps and advisors, we all think you should do this. And guess what? They've just revealed. Guess who was not part of any of those meetings? Daniel. But they got him. And notice the 3 charges they level against Daniel. First of all, he's not one of us. He's one of the exiles. Secondly, he doesn't respect you as king. He doesn't pay any attention to you. And third, he doesn't respect your authority. He pays no attention to your injunction. This Daniel's got to go. And this proves it. But I want you to notice the king's reaction, verse 14. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed. It's interesting. That word distressed is actually a word that has the idea of stink. I couldn't help myself but just laugh. I thought, this is a Chuck word if I've ever seen one. This stinks. This reeks. That's the idea. He's not angry, okay? He's not anxious or agitated. He is absolutely, oh no, this is horrible. This is terrible. And it's a strengthened idea. As soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed, overwhelmed with just, oh no. And he set his mind on delivering Daniel. As soon as he heard this, I gotta think the moment that he hears this and realizes what's happened, he knows that he has been played. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. You say, well, what does that mean? I got to assume that what he did was he brought his attorneys in. He brought in his lawyers. He brought in his advisors that are really familiar with the Medo-Persian law and say there's got to be a loophole. There's got to be a way out of this. You can see the same thing, by the way, if you read the end of Esther. Haman gets the king to sign an order according to the law of the Medes and the Persians that on a certain day anybody can take up arms and go beat up the Jews and kill them if you want and take their stuff. Well, when the king realizes that his wife Esther is a Jew and oh my goodness, what have I done? Well, he has Haman executed and then has Mordecai sit down with him and they come up with a new law and say, okay, you know what? We're going to come up with another law. I can't unwrite that law, but what I can do is say Jews are allowed to arm themselves and anybody that comes after them, they can beat them up and take their stuff. So he basically armed everybody and lo and behold, nobody attacks the Jews. That's what the king spent the rest of the day trying to figure out with regard to Daniel. There's got to be a way. There's got to be a way around this. There's got to be a way to save him. There's got to be a way to do this. But when he runs out of time, verse 15, then these men came by agreement to the king. Again, there's their conspiracy, and they said to the king, recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians, and that no injunction or statute what the king establishes may be changed. This is fixed. You need to follow through with it. And you see how badly they want to get rid of Daniel. And they're not thinking, and this is what's amazing, they do not think for one instance that this is estranging them from the king. But that's what's going on. It's a very different response than what Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel 3. Remember when the people came up and said, hey, Didn't you tell us we all had to bow down? Yeah. Well, we all did except for 3 guys, Rakshak and Benny. They wouldn't bow down. And, they're the exiles from Judah. And remember what Nebuchadnezzar does? He gets hot and has the fiery furnace superheated and throws them in because they won't bow down to him. Well, Darius isn't responding that way at all. Quite the opposite. Oh, no, what have I done? There's got to be a way around this. And by the end of the day, there isn't a way around it. So he's got to follow through with the law that he made. In verse 16, the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. And before he was thrown in, notice, the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you." Now, that reads like a statement of faith on Darius's part. But there is no future tense, so to speak, in the Aramaics, like the Hebrew. This is a modal, so that's a fancy way to say this isn't your God will save you. This is may your God save you. Or one writer even translated it this way, your God must save you. And you can see the king does not demonstrate confidence that Daniel's going to be okay because his God's going to preserve him. The king is going to be up all night fasting and worried as to what happens to Daniel. And when he gets to the lion's den, he's going to weakly ask Daniel, "Did you survive? Was your God able to save you?" Listen, Darius does not make a great confession of faith here. What he does is he says, "Your God must save you because I can't." This is the plots of the wicked and actually the powerlessness of the king. Again, what's really on display here is the sovereignty of God. The king gives orders, okay, put Daniel in the lion's den. That's what I signed into law. That's what's legal. That's what I have to do. But he says to Daniel, "Your God whom you constantly serve will himself have to deliver you." Notice it says in verse 17, a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. They put the stone down. By the way, this is basically a cave with a hole that would be dug into the roof of the cave, and then you would lower or throw the victim in. The cave would have an outside access where the lions would go in, and then you could gate that off and feed them that way, etc. But there would be an area where the lions would be released, and they're there, and you drop them in, and it's just you and the lions, baby. And then they put the rock over the hole that's been carved out in the roof so that nobody can escape. And then they put a seal of clay around it, and then everybody stamps their signet ring into it so that if you break the seal, you can't fudge it, you can't restore it without everybody putting their signet in, so that it's guaranteed that this stays sealed all night. And that's what happens. Notice in verse 18, then the king went off to his palace, and he spent the night fasting. So he didn't have anything to eat. No entertainment was brought before him. That's, by the way, that's a word that's impossible to translate today. It basically means anything from no musicians, no dancers, no concubines, no entertainment, no distractions. The king is absolutely beside himself at having been played and having been tricked into ordering the execution of Daniel. He doesn't want anything to eat. He doesn't want anything to distract him. And you notice at the end of the verse, his sleep fled from him. He can't even sleep. Daniel is in the lion's den because the forces of evil want to get rid of him. And there's no one, not even Darius, that can save him. That's where we're left at the end of the plot of the wicked. And that brings us to verses 19 to 23, where we see God's sovereignty now in the power of God. Men have done their best to bring about the end of a man of God. And God has, a man of God that God has, in an extraordinary way, elevated to a position of authority. And there is no one who can deliver Daniel, not Daniel, not even the king. But God can. You see the impotence of the king here to start with, verse 19. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day, and he went in haste to the lion's den. By the way, the word haste in English implies quickly. The word, though, in the original actually conveys the idea of alarm. And the sun came up. He didn't just go quickly. He was in dismay. He was alarmed. He was concerned. This is the worst. He's hoping against hope that maybe Daniel's God could save him. And you can see that also in verse 20 when he had come near the den to Daniel. He's at the top where Daniel's been dropped in. And remember, Daniel's 80, so he's not a spring chicken. And yet, when he comes near the den to Daniel, he cries out with a troubled voice. That word troubled means pained, grieved. He's expecting to hear nothing back. He cries out with a troubled voice and speaks, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Listen, he's not expecting Daniel to say, yeah, I'm here. Yes, God was. He's just hoping against hope that Daniel's God can save him. I want to remind you, what do you think Daniel told Darius before he got thrown in? Listen, I'm going to guess he said the same thing that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said. My God, whom I serve, is able to save me from the lion's den, but even if not, I trust him. Throw me in. That's real faith. And you know what? Even though he's 80 and he stands no chance against the lions, I mean, at 62, I'd be worried about the fall. Much less 80. Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Notice the power of the Almighty. The power of God. Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God has sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me as much as I was found innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. Isn't that amazing? Listen to the testimony of Daniel. There's no bitterness. There's no resentment. There's no anger. There's no, how could you be so stupid as to sign that law? There's no hatred or animosity toward those who have thrown him in. Just a clear, clarion call testimony to the Lord his God. O king, live forever. My God sent his angel. There's some discussion about this angel. Is it the pre-incarnate Christ? I would say no. I would say it's likely the same angel that stood in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's no reference to Daniel having worshipped, and it's not that Daniel says, my God came and saved me. He sent his angel. And that angel shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me. And I was found innocent before him. How is he innocent before God? Because that law commanded him not to worship God. And you know what Daniel did? The same thing the apostles did. As for you, you can decide whether it's better for me to obey you rather than God. But as for me, I will obey God rather than men. You want to punish me? Go ahead and punish me, but I'm going to worship God. Same thing the apostles did. Same thing Daniel does. I don't believe for a moment that Daniel had any hesitation to continue his practice of praying and worshiping God regularly like he had committed to. I was found innocent before him. And also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. I've done nothing against you, your authority, or your government. And so the king was very pleased, and he gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. And so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and this is amazing. No injury whatever was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Including the fall into the lion's den, including the whole night he spent with the lions, God preserved him. Listen, God can deliver his people from any earthly trial or context. He can. Just because he can doesn't mean that he will. But he very clearly did on 2 occasions in the book of Daniel. Even outside of the promised land, he preserved Daniel's friends from the fiery furnace, and he preserved Daniel from the lion's den. Why? As a testimony to you and I and to all peoples throughout all times that God is able to preserve his people. And that leads us finally to the proclamation of the king. Look at verses 24 to 28 with me. Notice first his proclamation against the wicked. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. That should cause you to sit up. The guys that plotted against Daniel got their comeuppance, but it wasn't just them. It was also their wives and their children. You say, that doesn't sound very biblical. I thought the Old Testament said that children were not to be punished for the crimes or the offenses of their parents. The Bible does say that. Darius is not a Jew. Darius is not a believer. Darius is a king, a pagan king. Darius has been played by these guys he elevated into the highest positions in his government. And they played him like a fiddle or a cello. And lo and behold, afterwards, guess what he does? He makes a statement not just to them, but to all of his governors, you don't mess with me. This is very typical of ancient judicial affairs in the ancient Near Eastern kingdoms. Very severe, very swift, very abundant wrath exercised. The king gave orders and brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And by the way, notice those same lions that left Daniel alone all night because an angel was with him and closed. By the way, the king doesn't get any sleep that night. I got to imagine Daniel slept fine. Daniel slept fine. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. They didn't even hit the floor, and the lions were on them and just shredded them. That's Darius's proclamation against the wicked. Then he makes a proclamation about God. I want you to notice it in verse 25. God is acknowledged again by a pagan king because he's sovereign over all. He's sovereign over creation. He's sovereign over his nation. He's sovereign over all kingdoms and over history itself. He is sovereign over every king. He is the one who raises up and the one who brings down. And that's what Darius attests to. Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land. This goes out as a formal proclamation from King Darius to all in the kingdom of Babylon now that he rules. May your peace abound. Standard greeting from a king. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. Notice he doesn't call him his God, but he does identify him as Daniel's God. Because he is the living God and enduring forever. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. And he has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. I can't help but recall the previous ways God has moved Gentile rulers to testify to himself throughout the book of Daniel. The constant theme of the book of Daniel is God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty not just over his people, but all peoples. God's sovereignty over not just his land, but the whole earth. God's sovereignty over not just who is a king in his kingdom, but in all kingdoms. And that God has a goal and a purpose and an intention for all of redemptive history to end with his establishment of his eternal kingdom. That's what we're going to see played out before us from Daniel 7 through 12. Notice the summation statement here in verse 28 as we wrap this up. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Daniel continues in service to the king for at least the next 3 years. You say, how do you know that? Because from chapter 7 through chapter 12, there are indications at the beginning of chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 that tell us that we're going back in time. And these visions, these experiences of Daniel are from back in those points in time that have already been covered by the overall narrative. For example, in Daniel 7, verse 1, it says, the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions, and here's what it is. In Daniel 8 and verse 1, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar the king, he had another vision. In Daniel chapter 9, in verse 1, it says, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, in that first year of his reign, I noticed this while I was reading Jeremiah. In chapter 10 and verse 1, it's the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. By the way, again, notice there's the specific reference to Cyrus as different from Darius. A message was revealed to Daniel, and this is what it is. And then finally, in Daniel chapter 11, it's the first year of Darius the Mede. I arose to be an encouragement and protection. And I'll tell you the truth. Here's what it is. Listen. From this point on, we're going to get into the prophetic section of the book of Daniel. And you know what's already been revealed through the life of Daniel and his three friends and the way that God worked through pagan kings? That God is sovereign. God is sovereign. God is sovereign over his people, over their individual lives and over their corporate existence. God is sovereign. God is sovereign in deciding who is elevated into the White House and who is taken out. God is sovereign. God is sovereign over every government. God is sovereign over all of his creation. God is actually at work moving all things, first, for the good of his people, Romans 8, and second, to the ultimate conclusion of his kingdom, which he is aiming for, and he hits the target every time. Everything that happened in Daniel 1 to 6 confirms that everything that God says is going to happen in Daniel 7 to 12 is just as certain, because God is sovereign. Let me close by asking you one simple question. Are you living your life as a believer like Daniel, so that he could use you to glorify himself just like he did Daniel? Is your life really characterized by that kind of an integrity? And whatever it is that you choose to do with your life, whatever your circumstance, whether you're a housewife, a mom, whether you're a grandmother, whether you're a son, a daughter, whether you're a bricklayer or a postal worker, whether you're retired, whether you're a school teacher, whether you're a student, whether you're an engineer or a fighter pilot or whatever, a welder, a dishwasher. Do you live your life and do your very best to glorify God and work hard to be God's kind of person all day, every day for his glory? Is your life so characterized by integrity that if somebody wanted to bring you down, they would have to say, well, the only thing I can get on her is that her absolute devotion is to God. Not just that she's always at church on Sunday, but her integrity in the sight of God, his integrity in the sight of God, that's unwavering. If you're living that kind of life, God can make good use of you, and he will. Just understand this. The more devoted to God you are, that doesn't mean the better your life will go. Many times, God takes his choicest servants who are most faithful to him, and he puts them through the most challenging and difficult of circumstances. Why? Same reason he did it with Job. Because real faith is something that God can and will put on display for all to see, because it glorifies him and is a privilege to you. Let's pray. Father, thank you for Daniel and the example of Daniel. and your sovereignty over his circumstance, and your sovereignty over even the climax of not just Daniel 6, but the climax of his life that's recorded in the rest of the book that speaks to ultimately the revelation of your future intentions for bringing in your kingdom. We pray that you would help us to recognize that our God is his God, the living God, the one, the true, the only God. And in his context, he was looking forward with expectation to you fulfilling your promises to send your one and only Son to come yourself and make the way possible for our sins to be forgiven. Well, we, in this context in redemptive history, can look back and see that you did it exactly the way you told Daniel you were going to do it. It's going to be amazing looking at texts that detail the events of the life of Christ right up to the cross and how you announced it. So, Lord, help us to be people of faith who live for you, who love you, and who are characterized by integrity in your sight, in our home lives, in our lives outside the home, and in our lives and ministries within the church. Help us to live in such a way that when others see us, they see children of you. For your glory, I pray, amen.